I want to announce our next speaker. First off, if you have a name of Freeman Bird, you're going to have an interesting background. Don't you think? A name says a lot of things. And his parents, I'm sure, named him, right? Okay, and so they had some insight as to the journey that this young man was going to take and is continuing to take. So I'm going to read here. Freeman Bird was raised in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. In his youth, he visited and lived in many nations because of his father's job as a salesman. When he turned 18, he decided he no longer believed in God. And consequently, and you know what? I love your honesty in this. This is good. And consequently decided to have his records removed from the church. In the years that followed, he went through a period where he tried to find what he could call truth. Freeman found himself at opposite ends of reality. One year, he was an atheistic communist. Another year, he imagined paganism was the answer. It would be some time before his wanderings led him back to the beginning of his journey, back to Mormonism. However, in what can only be properly described as a path of miracles, he ended up not in the mainline church, but as a member of Christ Church, the righteous branch. Do we call it the branch for short sometimes? Yeah, okay. Freeman is now serving as a full-time missionary, teaching people the fundamental fullness of the gospel in hopes that others might experience something akin to his own experiences. Freeman has a deep love of history and religion and seeks to gather all the truth that Mormonism has a divine right to. His presentation is titled The Lost Tribes of Israel and the Law of Moses. Freeman Bird.
So my topic is the lost tribes of Israel and the law of Moses. Now, I'm fascinated by the law of Moses. And I'm also fascinated by the lost tribes and their wanderings, where they went. Now, if you could go to the next slide. The question I asked is where they went. But further, part of my question is, did they still live the law of Moses? Did they still have a remnant of that in their traditions? Now, I found some interesting things. In some ways, they might have actually held to some remnant of their traditions, but in many ways, maybe not. Go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to be going over 4 different groups. Now, these groups don't necessarily fit into our conception of the 10 lost tribes, all taken at once by the Assyrians through successive kings. But rather, also I included 3 other groups who I would also note that I would identify as a part of Israel. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So I started with the Phoenicians, and I called this part Beyond the Pillars because after the Pillars of Hercules, which the Phoenicians famously and quite often crossed between, this is the Straits of Gibraltar. This is over near Spain and Morocco. And the Phoenicians had many exploits beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Go to the next slide, please. So, in order to make things easy for those who don't know about all these groups and all these people, I decided to start to describe and understand who exactly these people were. And the Phoenicians themselves were a collection of city-states. Now, in biblical times, they were collections of Canaanites at some points and also confederated to a degree with the Israelites. I think two of the most important cities, the city of Sidon and the city of Tyre, were among their most powerful. They were very good at sailing. In fact, their ships actually resemble very much some of the Viking longboats. And they became rich by taking advantage of the Mediterranean, taking advantage of the dye trade. They were one of the only ones who would actually supply the whole of the Mediterranean with purple, because they had access to a type of snail which only grows and lives on their coast. And so they harvested that snail and they sold it. Whether they were selling it to King Solomon or to the Macedonians or the Romans, it didn't matter to them. All that mattered was the bottom line. Of course, our modern alphabet also comes from Phoenicia. There is also, of course, a connection to the Phoenician alphabet and Paleo-Hebrew, which has even older roots. But take the Latin script we use today. In this presentation itself is all written with Latin script. That comes from Phoenicia. Also, Norse runes bear a striking similarity to the Phoenician script. Also, the Etruscan script. The Etruscans lived north of the Romans and were conquered by them, as well as Greek. Greek is also famous for, and even has legends associated with how they gained that language. We're going to talk a little bit about that. But one of their most important colonies, Carthage, would end up rivaling the Romans and would provide, and would even found colonies themselves. But if we could move to the next slide. So this is a map of some of the journeyings that the Phoenicians took, and you can see this is their home. Now, Sidon and Tyre right here, these are the most important cities. Tyre itself is probably the most eminent because Tyre was the one that founded all these colonies. Of course, the most important being Carthage right here. And Carthage itself had colonies in Sardinia and Sicily. They tried to conquer Sicily multiple times, and Spain, and even beyond in Northern Europe. In fact, much of the tin trade from Britain, much of the tin of the ancient world comes from Britain because of the Phoenicians. Also, before we move on, I'd like to take note of Gadir or Cadiz. You might draw a similarity between Gad and Gadir, but go on to the next slide and we'll continue forward. So according to the biblical narrative, Phoenician cities, including Sidon and Tyre, were counted among and were marked for conquest and actually to be given, I think, to the tribe of Asher, if I'm not mistaken. Now, in this narrative, we also find that the city of Sidon actually resists and very fiercely resists, and it seems for a time that they won't be conquered. But they eventually do get conquered, although it's not maybe in the same fashion as the rest of Canaan was conquered. And I would also go on to point out that in these Phoenician cities, after their conquest, the Canaanites weren't totally expelled. This can be clear by the religious rites of the Phoenicians and their pattern of worship, which was not the same as the Israelites, even though they remained close ties of kinship. And of course, most famously, I think, in the example of Solomon and Hiram, Solomon, of course, the king of Israel, and Hiram was the king of Tyre. Now, if you could go to the next slide. This is actually a quote from the scripture. This is in Joshua. Even unto great Sidon, and then the coast turneth to Ramah, and to the strong city of Tyre. This is the inheritance of the tribe of the children of Asher. So, of course, I mentioned that Asher was to be designated and given these lands as an inheritance forever. Go on to the next slide. I did mention Hiram and Solomon, and Hiram was the king of Tyre. Sometimes he's attributed as the one who started to make Tyre really powerful, because Tyre was actually kind of, subject to Sidon until Hiram may have actually reversed that relationship and made Tyre the most preeminent among all the Phoenician cities. Hiram himself is described in the scriptures as a descendant of Naphtali through his father, and also a descendant of Dan through his mother. And so clearly, I think with Hiram, we have an idea, a concept of an Israelite ruling class. However, at the same time, we can also see that they didn't really always obey the precepts of Moses. I would also add that, of course, Hiram and Solomon are both have an interesting connection in Freemasonry. Just as an aside, and I won't go too much into it, but there is a very interesting connection there, to be sure. Go on to the next slide. Now, with talking about the Phoenicians, it's hard not to talk about Carthage, which became the greatest and most powerful of all the Phoenician cities, and even had its own empire in North Africa. They even went on their own expeditions across around Africa. They explored, and they certainly got rich off of the trade. Now, the foundation of the city of Carthage is actually quite interesting. The story goes that Dido, who was a princess or a queen of the city of Tyre, actually flees her tyrannical brother and ends up landing in Africa. Now, the native Berber people, the king says, well, here's an ox hide. Whatever the ox hide, however far you can get this ox hide to stretch, I'll let you have that land. And so she takes that hide and cuts it up into very small strips and surrounds a very large area, which would become the foundation of the city of Carthage. Carthage itself would grow in prominence very quickly. And after Queen Dido, it's actually transitions from a monarchy to a republic. And they had 2 judges. Further, I would explain that Carthage, although one of the strongest and most eminent of these Phoenician cities, really didn't follow the law of God very well at all. There are some exceptions, though. In fact, a lot of people don't know, but the very oldest synagogue in the whole world that we still know about and still actually exists today and still is used by Jews is in modern day Tunisia. It's actually on an island off the coast of Tunisia. And this synagogue dates back to about 600 or the 6th century BC. This synagogue, I personally believe, was probably founded by those fleeing from Israel during the conquest of the Babylonians. And it would further make sense, if you have knowledge of the Book of Mormon, to connect the Phoenician trade colonies to even go, as I mentioned here, potentially establishing contact with the Americas. Now, there is there are some other interesting things that the Carthaginians or the Phoenicians did. They're actually attributed to the first circumnavigation of Africa by Herodotus. And that was actually, they were hired by Pharaoh Necho II, and they rounded the whole bit of Africa. They went down the Horn and they came up, and it's recorded by Herodotus. And this, I think, attests to their prowess at sea. And so it's of no great stretch to say that they could have also sailed to the Americas. But go ahead to the next slide. But the Phoenicians really were an affront to God. They did not adhere to the laws. They still maintained the traditions of Canaan. And for this, we can see that they weren't really blessed. In fact, they were actually destroyed by the Romans. In fact, probably most significant among these traditions, and even repeated by both Greek and Romans, is the tradition of child sacrifice. And they actually did sacrifice their children to their god, and his name is, if I could find it, his name is, I think, Baal-Hamon. I could be wrong about that, but Baal-Hamon is also equivalent with the Greek Kronos. And if you can go to the next slide, we can see an example. This is by Diodorus Siculus, and he, meaning Himilcar, who was actually in the midst of conquering the island of Sicily, which is in southern Italy, supplicated the gods after the custom of his people by sacrificing a young boy to Cronus and a multitude of cattle to Poseidon by drowning them in the sea. So they still maintain that tradition, and I'll tell you what happens to the Carthaginians in this war. They actually lose, and Himilcar actually dies in this war. And so you can see what favor they got from the gods for that. But I maintain that at least, even though these Phoenicians did have a great trade empire, and they did contribute to the spread of the script we use today, they didn't really maintain or adhere to the law of Moses very much. Go on to the next slide. So now the Greeks, and the Greeks really of Homer, of the Odyssey and the Iliad. Go ahead to the next slide. Now, the Greeks, similar to the Phoenicians, were a collection of city-states. There was no unified Greek nation, no unified Greek idea, and that didn't come until much, much later. They shared a common language, at least common enough to understand each other. They shared common religious rites. They did sacrifices, perhaps not always in the way of the Hebrews, but they did sacrifices nonetheless. They had many forms of government, many experimental governments like the Athenian democracy. Of course, we also have the Spartan diarchy, very militaristic, and we have other examples of attempts, of course, even theoretical attempts to achieve different kinds of governments, like the speculations of Plato and his ideal philosopher kings. But the Greeks are, of course, most famous for some of the philosophies they produced. The Danans, or the Achaeans, and the Dorians are the principal people I will be looking at. The Danans and the Dorians were, the Danans were the ones who fought in the Trojan War on the side of the Greeks, the Achaeans, and the Dorians are best known for their connection to Sparta. Go ahead to the next slide. You can see here a map of Greece and her colonies. Now, this was not unified, and in fact, many of her colonies of each city-state would often declare independence and go their own way, both ideologically, politically, economically. It would be often that after a few generations, the settlers would gain independence one way or another. But you can see they went very far, and in fact, they even explored up north, and there is speculation they explored Britain, they explored parts of Scandinavia even, what they called Hyperborea. Go ahead to the next slide. We have an interesting thing from Greek history itself, where the Greeks actually describe many times in the foundation of many of their cities, they actually describe their connection to Egypt. Now, this man, Hecataeus of Abdera, he relates a story, and I'll actually bring up a quote shortly after. And he notes two things: that some of the leaders of this exodus, Danis and Cadmus, Danis, of course, being connection to the Danans, and Cadmus is actually more closely associated with the Phoenicians. They said they migrated to Greece, these exiles from Egypt, while others migrated into Syria, which is what the Greeks called Canaan and the Levant. He calls Moses their leader, and many Greek cities, including Athens, were founded by colonists from Egypt. Diodorus relates that the oldest Greek city, Argos, which is the home of the Argonauts, was founded by a man named Danis, and likely the same as Hecataeus' Danis. Go ahead to the next slide. This is the quote. The Egyptians, formerly being troubled by calamities, in order that the divine wrath might be averted, expelled all the aliens. Now, this isn't a primary source, but it is relating a history from a man who probably knew a little bit more about their own history than we do. Go ahead to the next slide. And there is a connection further with the Greeks and the Phoenicians. Of course, I mentioned Cadmus earlier. Cadmus was actually from the city of Tyre, and Cadmus was the one who delivered the alphabet to Greece. He is also, I think, the founder of the city of Thebes, and this is, of course, different from the Egyptian city of Thebes, which is where the name comes from. The Egyptian city is known as the 100-gated Thebes, while this Greek Thebes by Cadmus was called the 7-gated Thebes. And I would suggest that the name Cadmus really is associated with the tribe of Gad. But there is one more thing with this. Another famous figure from Greek mythology actually does come also from Phoenicia and from kind of out of Egypt too, and it is connected with them, and that her name is Europa. Europa is associated with Zeus and is the namesake for the whole continent of Europe. I thought I'd mention that because it was quite interesting. Go ahead to the next slide. The Lacedaemonian correspondence. Now, the Lacedaemonians are the Spartans, and this was during the Maccabean revolt. The leaders of the Maccabean revolt actually were looking for allies. They actually talked to the Romans. They talked to some Greeks. They tried to find help. They didn't find much, but they tried. And we actually find an interesting connection here because it's between the king of Sparta and the leader of the Maccabeans that we find a connection drawn by the Spartans to the Israelites. If you go to the next slide, Arius, king of the Lacedaemonians, to Onias, the high priest, greeting. It is found in writing that the Lacedaemonians and Jews are brethren, and that they are of the stock of Abraham. So that's in scripture. Of course, not all recognize the authority of the Maccabeans and that scripture, but nonetheless, it implies that the Spartans actually had a record of this. They found this in writing, and they understood it as well as the Jews did. And the idea of their shared origin was not unknown. Now, go ahead to the next slide. Now, in connecting back to the laws of Moses, the Greeks didn't necessarily follow all their statutes. However, we have some things. The Greeks weren't very fond of murder. They stuck to many of the basic precepts, which many people, but I wouldn't necessarily attribute these to Moses, rather just their normal state of governance, their natural laws. But there is, interestingly enough, multiple times where Greek philosophers, poets, and such connected their works to Moses. The Hellenistic Jewish philosopher Aristobulus of Alexandria is well known for having cemented a connection between Jewish thought and Plato, and Numenius of Apamea too has drawn similar parallels. Go ahead to the next slide. This is a famous quote. Some of you may have seen it. For what is Plato but Moses speaking in Attic Greek? Now, I don't necessarily agree with all that Plato says, nor do I think that he was necessarily 100% inspired by Moses. However, there is no doubt that his thought has influenced us probably more than any other Greek in history. Perhaps the others being Socrates and Aristotle being of a significant influence. But if you go to the next slide, we can move on to the third group, which I call the Trojans, who were the enemies of the Greeks in the Trojan Wars and would eventually be destroyed. Go ahead to the next slide. Now, the Trojans themselves, they settled in the Dardanelles in Asia Minor. The Dardanelles, of course, coming from Dardanus, who was the ancestor of the Trojans. They're with the Trojans, there actually was doubt about their existence for a long time. And a lot of people didn't think they existed until I think it was a German or Englishman who decided to go dig it up. And he dug too deep and he actually lost a lot of artifacts in the process. But we did find the city of Troy and it was real. But the stories associated with Troy may not always be 100% accurate. There is, of course, an interplay between the gods, and it is with the Iliad and the Odyssey interwoven with mythology. They worship similar gods. Like the Greeks, they had a pantheon, and a lot of their pantheon were intrinsically tied to the Greek pantheon. And of course, something I'll be talking about here is a legendary connection, which the Romans consistently claimed. Both historians and poets claimed a connection between Rome and Troy. Go ahead to the next slide. This is the Roman Empire during Trajan's rule. It's at its height here, and this is their maximum extent. But if you go ahead to the next slide, we can see, well, if they did have a connection to Israel, what was that connection? Now, the Dardanus, who is the namesake for the Dardanelles, that strait in Asia, near Asia Minor, he was a son of Zerah. This, of course, I draw this conclusion with looking at some of Josephus's writings. Josephus was a Jewish Roman historian, very famous. And he said that Darda, the name of Zerah's fifth son, is actually the same as the Greek Dardanos. That connects Dardanus, Dardanos, and thus through Zerah we find Dardanus, and through Dardanus we find Troy, and from Troy we find Rome. Go ahead to the next slide. This is an interesting quote by John Maclaren, who is writing in the history of ancient Caledonia, the Caledonians living in Scotland, and if you wanted to know where they were from. And it reads, "The Hebrews then built an altar to the Lord, being delivered from the Egyptians. The king of Greece visited their camps with his Hebrew servant, telling them to build a city and fortify themselves against their enemies. They then commenced to build the city of Troy. I find that very interesting, how the Hebrews are intrinsically linked to the foundation of this city. Go ahead to the next slide. Aeneas is a famous figure, and he's famous for some of his exploits, his adventure. It's kind of similar to the Odyssey in a way, but he was the leader of the exiles of the Trojans. Many other people claim to be descended from the Trojans, but the Romans probably have the most consistent claim to this. As an example of what Aeneas did and how he left Troy, the Greeks offered all the Trojans to bring one possession which they could carry. Now, out of all the possessions, Aeneas chose to carry his father out of the city. And the Greeks saw such great honor in him carrying his old father who couldn't really walk, that they said, well, you can take one more thing. He's like, and so he went and he got all the house idols, the center of religion. And he so confounded the Greeks that they said, well, you can just go ahead and take anything you want. You're too honorable for us. Aeneas actually does tie into the story of Dido, the founder of the city of Carthage. He actually, according to legend, arrives at that city. Dido falls in love with him, and Aeneas rejects her, and then she kills herself on a funeral pyre, basically, and also curses Rome at Aeneas and his descendants at the same time, foreshadowing the Carthaginian war, the Carthaginian-Roman conflicts in the future. Now, of course, through Aeneas and his followers, we have Romulus and Remus, who would found the city of Rome. And this according to both Livy and, of course, Virgil, who wrote the Aeneid, which is, those two are their primary sources on Aeneas. But if you could go to the next slide. Now, although Rome does have a legendary history and a legendary connection, for the most part, they did not adhere to the law. Now, Rome, however, did come to a lot of natural laws, and you can find similarities between those. I remember an earlier presentation yesterday that actually noted some of those natural laws. And although Rome did have religious rites, they had precepts, they had an ordered judgment system to obtain justice for the common citizenry, they didn't really follow. In fact, they even insulted at times the Sabbath. They saw it as idleness. They saw, well, why should I skip out on a day of work when I can work more, gain more money, and not be so lazy? And they actually thought the Jews were lazy because of that. Now, there is one interesting connection with the names here. Jove, which is also Jupiter or Zeus in Rome, in Roman mythology. Jove is actually, the J isn't pronounced J, it's pronounced like a Y, and the V is actually pronounced like a W. And so there could be, although it's a stretch, a connection between the name of Yahweh and Yahweh or Jehovah. But I would maintain that that could be a stretch. Now, the final group I like to talk about, and if you could change the slide. Now, these are the actual lost tribes that were lost during the Assyrian deportations. The previous three groups, the Phoenicians, the Greeks, and the Trojans. The Phoenicians broke away from Israel after the Exodus. The Greeks and Trojans, during and shortly after the Exodus, broke away. In fact, some of the Greeks, I maintain, probably left Egypt straight away and just sailed away one way or another, which is one of the reasons why they might have not maintained the law. However, this third group, the Scythians, who are a nomadic tribal group, they have a slightly different story, and their history ties into an even wider scheme than even the likes of Rome, Greece, or Phoenicia. Go ahead to the next slide. The Scythians being a nomadic group, were known for their skill in the horse and chariot. The Hebrews actually, interestingly enough, when they were taken into captivity, they were actually employed by the Assyrians specifically for their skill in chariotry. The Scythians themselves historically had a very large birth. They had a range, a really huge range, and their influence in many of these northern nations cannot be understated. And their existence is very intrinsically tied to the Assyrian Empire and its fall. Go ahead to the next slide. Now, I have this map. This is kind of where the Scythians might have, well, not might have, we do know these are actually the more confirmed places. There are even more outlandish claims than this. But I'll point out where a few of these people, who a few of these people were, where they lived, and why. Now, over here, if you can see, this is where Media was. This is where the Scythians, or the Israelites, were initially deported to. The Medians were Persians. They spoke an Indo-European language. Their language was similar, more similar to ours than ours is similar to Hebrew. I would maintain that that's where the Israelites would have learned an Indo-European language, which the Scythians historically did speak. The Massagetae, Manasseh, lived around here, and also they were scattered around too. They were called Saka or Sake, and many of them actually went into India. Some claim that even Buddha's ancestors might have been Scythian. If they were, I'm not sure. Some of those are more fringe claims. However, it remains notable that Buddha's ancestors were among the ruling class of India, so it would be no surprise if a conquering nomadic group who established themselves, became Brahmins, then birthed Buddha somewhere in Nepal. There are, over here in China, this is the Ordos group. We actually do have ruins or artifacts only 100 miles north of Beijing, which have been confirmed to be Scythian in origin. And of course, also Persia was actually conquered by these Scythians. They were called the Parthians. And the homeland of the Scythians, or the central region, is actually right here in Crimea. And they were called the Royal Scythians, being the purest or the strongest, the greatest. Maybe they called it themselves because they felt that way about themselves. Go ahead to the next slide. The Assyrian deportations, one of the most significant events in Israel's history. They occurred over a successive series of kings, and the majority of these 10 tribes were deported. Now, I would maintain that about 9.5 aren't really on this earth anymore, but that half, a tribe of Israel, became the Scythians. And I did mention this bottom part, that many of the tribes adopted aspects of Indo-European life, including horse archery and language. Go ahead to the next slide. This is where we get the scripture, 2 Kings 18. The king of Assyria carried the Israelites away to Assyria, settled them in Halah, on the harbor, the river of Gozan, in the city of the Medes, because they did not obey the voice of the Lord, their God, but transgressed his covenant. All that Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded, they neither listened or obeyed. It's clear these Israelites were punished for not following the law, so I wouldn't be too surprised if they didn't follow much of the law after they were deported. But we actually find some interesting things and some things which they did maintain from the law of Moses. Go ahead to the next slide. The fall of Assyria was actually a war between the Medes, who had cast the Scythians out, these Israelites out. They didn't want them among them. They were causing trouble. The Scythians were actually aligned with the Assyrians until close to the Battle of Nineveh, when Nineveh, one of the largest cities on earth, was destroyed by a coalition of Babylonian and Assyrian forces. And the Scythians would actually rampage throughout the Middle East at this time, even going to Egypt, making threats, going back, running around, and then they kind of fade away and they just go north. There's actually, I think, a pass in Georgia and Russia today in the Caucasus Mountains, which is sometimes referred to as the Pass of Israel. Now, if we could go to the next slide. But the Scythians traveled far. And I want to name some of the groups, the people they might have become or influenced or taken a, maybe a, even if not a direct blood descendant, perhaps a cultural transmission. The Emerald Isle, of course, I refer to Ireland. And I do maintain that there are legends, such as in the Declaration of Arbroath, one of the oldest Scottish documents, actually talks about their legendary ancestry from a Scythian and an Egyptian. I would maintain that's really just them saying they, through translation and time, they were descended from Israel. But also in Germany, Saxons or Alans or Goths, Vandals, many of these groups, I would say, were descended from Israelites. The Anglo-Saxons probably being one of the more prominent ones, in they having eventually invaded England and had very interesting laws, which harken back to Israel, I'd say. And one group would travel through the Balkans. They were called the Cimmerians, the Scythians, or they were kind of Scythians, the Cimbri or the Kirmu. They actually threatened Rome. In fact, the Marian reforms were because this group of migrating Scythians was so powerful and so strong that they had to change how they recruited people in Rome. It used to be only nobles could fight, but now they had to, with the Marian reforms, introduce a wider girth of people. Go ahead to the next slide. But the Scythians also have influence in the Far East. I would even say that the Japanese kingdom of Kibi, which is in southern Japan, these statues right here are actually from Kibi in Japan, and many have noted that they bear Scythian elements or an Iranian influence, which the Scythian culture definitely was Iranian. And of course, I mentioned the Parthians, India as Hephthalites and other groups, China as the Yuezhi, and Korea. In fact, the kingdom of Silla, their crowns, which are on display and pretty easy to find, they bear a great resemblance to some crowns you can find, Scythian crowns you can find in Afghanistan. Of course, some people also say that in Afghanistan, there's also a connection to some of the tribes of Israel, which was also a common stomping ground for the Scythians. Now, and after the fall of the Roman Empire, these Scythians migrated into the Roman Empire, and in the East, they influenced religion. They influenced the caste system. Some say even the samurai might have their origin as Iranian nomadic warriors. If you go to the next slide. Now these Scythians did hold to a remnant of the law. Some of them, at least. Take, for example, their restriction on pork. They were one of the few people in history. Also in that small group of people in history are the Scots, who have a connection to Scythia. And they didn't eat it. They didn't even use it in their sacrifices. They didn't see it as clean. And they still, however, were cast out because they rejected the law of Moses. And so it's of no surprise that most of the precepts of Israel did not come with them, but some did. Go to the next slide. This is Herodotus. Such are the observances of the Scythians with respect to sacrifice. They never use swine for the purpose. nor indeed is it their wont to breed them in any part of the country. They didn't like it. They clearly didn't. The Greeks noted such. The Greeks ate pork. The Spartans definitely ate pork. They drank a drink made out of pork blood, basically. And so you can see a difference in perhaps the cultural traditions that the Scythians maintained by living the law of Moses for so long, as opposed to these Dorians from Sparta who didn't live it so long and who departed from Israel much earlier. If you could go ahead to the next slide. But also many of the descendants of the Scythians in Europe, for example, we have instances where, especially in the Celtic church, people maintained a lot of the law, and they really stuck to it, even in spite of the papal authority in Rome really pushing against them and eventually succeeding. The celebration of Passover, one of the most famous celebrations, feasts. These Celtic Christians often connected Passover to Easter, and they held it just around the same day. But if you go ahead to the next slide. So, in conclusion, now this is a very broad topic, and I could have probably focused on one group and given it a whole hour presentation, probably even longer. And I can conclude that Israel did indeed spread far, and I didn't even really scratch the surface on some of these things. From the child sacrificing Phoenicians to the philosophizing Greeks, the all-conquering Romans, and the nomadic Scythians, lost Israel had a wide range. And the lost tribes, may they be from the Assyrian deportations or from other separations, they didn't have a pristine track record. But there is still yet a remnant of the law. With the advent of Christianity, however, and its spread under the guidance of Christ, apostles, and disciples, many of these once lost sheep entered the fold and covenant again. And go to the next slide. And this is a quote I like from Joseph Smith in the D&C. And verily I say unto you that it is my will that you should hasten to translate my scriptures and to obtain a knowledge of history and of countries and of kingdoms, of laws of God and man, and all this for the salvation of Zion. Amen. So in saying this, I hope to at least introduce some of you to the idea and what history and the study of history can bring you, that it might enlighten you and help you understand, if not the successes of some people, maybe look at their failures and don't repeat. But if you go to the last slide, thank you. That's all I have to say.
Okay, before I've got one question here, and you have a couple there. Here, I'll move and grab them. Thank you. A question I have: was this pretty much self-taught?
Yes.
Your own investigation, your own research?
Well, yeah. I looked into a lot of it myself. Of course, other people have looked into the lost tribes and detailed their wanderings, and I took no small influence from them. I learned from them. If they had already done the work, I just might have added on some things.
Beautiful. And then the other question I have, because I'm the moderator, I get to ask questions, right? The return of the 10 tribes that we read so much about.
Of course.
What's your opinion on that returning as one big group? Is it just your thoughts on that?
Well, sure. And that's an interesting question. And the lost tribes of Israel, I think, are scattered among the earth today, but there is also a great portion, I believe, according to some things which Joseph Smith said, that they're actually not on this earth right now, but that they will return. And the earth will swing to and fro like a drunken man when they return. And it'll be quite interesting to see them and meet them. And we might have some scriptures to share with them.
Beautiful. Okay, let's get to some questions here. Do you believe the 10 tribes are also a nation when Christ
United it or unites it.
is it visited or united?
Visit.
Visited.
So the
Do you believe the 10 tribes are also a nation? Oh, when Christ visited.
so I don't think they were necessarily a unified country. There were nations, certainly nations made up of almost or nearly 100% of these lost tribes. And there could perhaps be many of those nations. Some of those Germanic or Celtic tribes were probably very rich in the blood of Israel. Joseph Smith in his White Horse Prophecy actually mentions some of the nations, including, I think, France, Belgium, Germany, Netherlands, England, as these countries having the most of the blood of Israel, at least when it comes to Europe.
Sweet. Okay. Do you believe that we need to live the laws of Moses in our day and age?
Another good question for this. This is something I've studied and thought and pondered about a lot. And I can say right now that Joshua provides some very interesting arguments in favor. And it'll take some time for me to think about it and to see where I stand. But that's all I'll say about that.
Beautiful. Okay, here's another question. Have you delved into any research on DNA or language evidences?
Of course. Now, the DNA and language evidences themselves could be 2 or 3 other presentations. The DNA is widespread. You can look at the R1 haplogroup, R1A, R1B. This haplogroup is very closely associated with Indo-Europeans, Scythians, and the like. And we can look at DNA and we can look at that. We can also look at linguistic evidence. At shifts, there's many who have actually looked at maybe the English language itself and found Hebrew words or remnants of Hebrew in the English language. And there have been no shortage of studies comparing Hebrew to other languages as well.
Beautiful. Okay, what was a surprise or a revelation about your research for this particular presentation?
Well, I guess this is something I've researched and known about for quite some time. So there wasn't any immediate surprises when I restarted my research and compiled it all. But I think the most surprising thing is this group of people called the Scythians, how widespread they went and how much they accomplished, at least as a roving band of nomads. They were the Mongols before the Mongols, and how far and wide they went.
Excellent. Okay. You mentioned that these Israelites scattered, tried to spread and fought various land wars in Asia and tried to conquer Sicily, I think. Would you say that therefore that in forsaking the Lord's commandment, they fell victim to each of these classic blunders?
So just as when anyone transgresses the law, I think there's a pattern. You can see these patterns in the Book of Mormon. You can see these patterns in history. If a nation wants to do wicked things and do evil things, they will do it. And they will also suffer consequences for having done it. And with the conquest of Sicily by the Carthaginians, was there a divine retribution by the Romans later? I don't know, maybe. The Romans themselves were very bloodthirsty, and they salted the earth around Carthage so that nothing would grow there. And so were the Romans sinless? No. But were they punished specifically for having abandoned the laws? Some people, yes, but after so many generations, I can't imagine that God would punish a people who knew not his law.
Okay, what is the capital, or is there a capital of the northern kingdom of Israel?
The capital of the northern kingdom of Israel, now I think there was at least a center point for the northern kingdom of Israel, at least before the Assyrian deportations. There might have been multiple, but the name right now escapes me, so I couldn't tell you. I'm sure you could find it online very easily, though.
I just on that note, I mentioned earlier the city of Shechem the ancient city. It's called Nablus now. And the Samaritans, which I don't know how they tie in to the Northern Kingdom,
Yeah.
but that was kind of their sacred area.
So yeah, these Samaritans, many of these Samaritans were a mixed multitude of people. And when they came into these northern kingdoms and they were a part of this northern, they really claimed like connection back to Israel. Some of them may have been Israelites. Some of them may have not been.
Okay, excellent. How did you find and get interested in all this? And are there any books or other resources you would recommend?
So how did I find? I guess I found it because I've been obsessed with history ever since I was young. And are there any books? Well, a lot of the books that and you can read, if you have the little booklet, you can see all my sources.
Oh, good.
And there's a lot of sources
So
there.
it's in the
But
in the printed book.
There are.
Okay.
And there's a wide range of literature, specifically tackling even the Anglo-Saxons, a lot of those who follow the line of British Israelite connection. There's a plethora of work about that connection, just that one connection, probably more than any other connection. And really, I suppose there is one. I think it's it's in the book. It's by Ingersoll. I think it's called Lost Israel. But if you want to know, I don't have it on mind, but if you want to know, you can come to me after and I'll tell you.
Excellent. Maybe you can help me on this one.
Are you familiar with the book of Nephi? Do you follow the Table of Nations? Do I follow the Table of Nations? Now the book of Nephi, I think I've heard of it, but I don't think I've read it. Am I familiar with the Table of Nations? Like as in Genesis? Yes, I'm very familiar with that. And I looked and I've looked at a lot of maps. I've looked at a lot of places where people put people, and I've thought about who was who and what was what and where the people went and the associations with those nations back then and modern nations today. Where did the people go? How did they end up? I've looked at it, that's for sure. And it's very fascinating.
Awesome. That was great. We have one more question. Yeah, one more question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Since Isaiah 11:16, and just give your whatever
Sure.
based in the context of what you just went over. That's your thoughts on it.
11-16. Then will it happen on that day that the Lord will again acquire with his hand a second time the remnant of his people, who will remain from Assyria, from Lower Egypt, from Pathros to Cush, from Elam, from Shinar, from Hamath, and from the coastlands bordering the Mediterranean Sea. And he will lift up a signal for the nations, and assemble the outcasts of Israel, and will gather the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. Then the jealousy of Ephraim will depart, and those who harass Judah will be cut off. Ephraim will not be jealous of Judah, and Judah will not harass Ephraim. Ephraim and Judah will unite and swoop down on the slopes of the Philistines toward the west. Together they will plunder the sons of the east. They will possess Edom and Moab, and the sons of Ammon will be subject to them. And the Lord will utterly destroy the tongue of the sea of Egypt, and with his scorching wind, he will wave his hand over the river. He will strike and divide it into 7 channels and make people walk over in sandals. And there will be a highway from Assyria for the remnant of his people who will be left, just as there was for Israel in the day when they came out of the land of Egypt. Now, I've read that before, and I think there's something with, I think some of that's prophecy to come. I've heard people talk about the tongue of Egypt being destroyed. Well, the tongue of Egypt, the original tongue, is certainly no longer spoken, at least in the day was when this prophecy was written. When it talks about a second gathering, the Lord reaching his hand out a second time, I think there must be also a first gathering. I think the first was under Joseph Smith, and there is a second gathering to come. And I think it's in the process of happening right now. You had a question? I think I'd have to read it to remember it. Well, very good. And so, yeah, we can talk a little bit more about those verses, but I think they're intrinsically connected to a second gathering of Israel. And I think when it talks about all the places where they'll be scattered, I think they'll all be gathered again out of, really, it's trying to mention all the regions of the world that Isaiah knew of at that time. And talking about the isles of the sea and such, and all the places Israel is scattered among just about every continent, as far as I know, even Antarctica, even though most of those people don't live there permanently.